Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode number 182. No, sorry, 282. Boy, we've been doing this for a while. I am your host, Ellis, otherwise known as Train Man, and I apologize again for the lateness of this video. We've been a really hectic several weeks. I really don't have anything else to say on that front. Next week is a route review, so if you want your route reviewed, feel free to send it to me, get it to me, talk to me on Skype, bombs321. You can get to me just directly like that, or through the fan chat, which is linked in the Cargoes Every Terminus podcast. But anyway, let's talk about today. Today's subject is 587. Now let me pull up the comment, let me pull up the full wording of this. This was on Zombie Train number 227, so we are a little bit behind, but that's just fine. It means I have plenty in the backlog of questions. And of course, if you have a question, feel free to post it. 227. So, is it cat here? So 2026 production says NKP 587, please. Now, if I can recall the disposition of NKP 587 at like the beginning of World War Z, at the Great Panic, I don't think it was running. I don't remember it running. You know, I know that it was in that god-awful movie. I know that, yeah, it was in the middle of a restoration. That's right. It was literally in pieces, and I didn't know that. I didn't know that when I found out about where 587 was, and I was like, oh, this should be easy. You know, it's one of those where I expected it to be like a class, 1 or whatever. I don't remember. I already forgot the friggin' numbering system that I explained last time. Or the time before or whatever. I thought it was going to be an easy restoration, like, oh, it's out of service. We went in, it's got giant holes cut in the firebox. It's got, like, patches all over the place. The tubes, like, not all the tubes were present. And if I recall correctly, it didn't even have... There was something up with the tender. Because I remember having to source tender junk for it. So, yeah, there were a few things. There was a dry pipe available. There was... Yeah, no, I don't remember everything that was wrong with it. But there was plenty wrong with it. Now, the bright side is that most of the parts were there, and the engine was mostly in okay condition. It's one of those where it's been operated, it's been run, and it's been run, I mean, I wouldn't call it into the ground, but heavily, and they were in the process of revitalizing it because it had really been beaten up over the years. But it wasn't something that, like, it had sat out of service for a very long time, and it didn't need, like a whole new boiler or anything like that. It wasn't totally screwed, which is a nice thing to see in a locomotive that's shop-bound, especially one that was just taken in to get that restoration done. And, it was an operable restoration. It was from operation to operation, I believe. So, all things considered, wasn't the worst thing. It was just sort of a surprise to walk in there and be like, there's supposed to be a whole engine called 587, right? Not just bits and pieces scattered all over the shop. Whew. Yeah, that threw me for a loop. It was one of the earlier ones we went to. It's one of the ones, it was in... Oh, God, where was it? It was, like, somewhere in the south. It was, like, in Kentucky or something. No, right? Right? Am I confusing it with another Mikado? It's a Mikado, right? Let me... Yeah, no. I am confusing it with another engine. It was not in Kentucky. It ended up serving in Kentucky. It ended up serving all over the place because it got... well, we got it running and we sort of just tossed it around everywhere. It was a really good all-purpose engine. It almost got as much use as 3254 did in the, in the sort of middle, or the early middle of thing. That's right. No, it was at ITM. It was at ITM, which is, up in Indianapolis. I'm pretty sure I've talked about ITM before. Let me refresh my memory. So yeah, Indiana Transportation Museum. That's what ITM stands for. I'm not that stupid. And they are in Indiana. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I don't know why my mind was going to Kentucky, because that is way out of the way for where we would have been. We didn't go to the south a lot. That is not it. I just pulled up the wrong thing. I just pulled up the wrong thing. I was looking at maps of a different museum. So no, okay, it wasn't what I was thinking of. I don't think I've talked about this before. I don't think I've talked about ITM before. It wasn't really on my radar. I don't think it was, and it was just like, oh yeah, this is here. We go by this. This is here. Let's just run in and get the engine and go. It was a little bit more south than our normal routes, but it wasn't that far off. And we were just a little bit taken by surprise. And one of the things was, because it was off of our normal routes, because there wasn't really that much of a reason to go that way, or go down there, when we finally got 587 running, which was the only steam engine there, right? I'm not getting that wrong. We sort of just transplanted it. We were like, alright, you're gonna go elsewhere. And it went elsewhere, and it didn't really ever come back. So, it's one of those engines that sort of left its home and then didn't have a home. It sort of just meandered around the system wherever it was needed, because like I said, it was a very good all-around engine. It wasn't something that we got it and it was like, okay, this would be good for one very specific purpose. It wasn't like the Shays or the big boys or Northerns, really, because Northerns are less universal than you might expect when you have to do minimal track work. Or, any of the... it's a middle engine. It wasn't very big, it wasn't very small, and a lot of the Mikados had that. A lot of the Zombie Incorporated Mikados had that, where it was, okay, we've got all these engines, we've got this giant spread of engines. Some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are just right. And it was really nice to have an engine that was so very clearly in the middle, because those engines aren't necessarily the highest profile. A lot of those engines are, they sort of slide under the radar. There are a lot of Berkshires even, but Mikados, large and small, Pacifics sometimes, although they're usually pretty high profile just in terms of, oh wow, it's a Pacific. Consolidations, what I've talked about, there are a lot of consolidations, comparatively, compared to other locomotive types. What else? Mountain types, there aren't so many mountain types, and they were usually bigger. But just those. They would end up being squirreled away, or whatever. 10-wheelers as well. They would end up being sort of squirreled away or hidden. And they wouldn't get a lot of publicity, because they're too big in a lot of cases for a tourist railroad to operate. And they are too small to do, like, the high-profile excursions. I'm figuring the engines that really got publicity back in the day, were the ones that you could either cart around and put in movies and stuff like that and take from place to place, or the ones that were really big and people would come from across the country to see. I'm talking like 4449, UP844, that other one, that Milwaukee Road one. And yeah, and Mikado sort of fell in the weird gulf in the middle. which was definitely a shame. And that's the thing. So, of the locomotives that we had, most of them are ones that we recovered. There are engines that were in museums or in parks or whatever, and we decided that, okay, these are good enough, sort of, what's the word? Not test beds, but they're good bases for us to build working locomotives off of, because they were working locomotives at one point or another. So, we decided, okay, we're going to do that with these engines, and then, we sort of reached this point where we've got a lot of little engines, a lot of big engines, and not as many medium-sized engines as you might think. I've talked about, the quantities of engines. If you look at the size versus quantity, you have like 200 040s that survive, and then 060s and consolidations are up there as well, and then the numbers really start to drop off. So, we had a shortage, because you only need so many really big engines, but we had a shortage of medium-sized engines. Now, 587 was used to fill that gap somewhat, because 587 was, as previously stated, really useful and sent all over the place. And as were many other Mikados that we got our hands on, pretty much all three of the Valley Railroad locomotives and the main Strasbourg locomotives, that'd be 475 and 90, sort of the same deal. We just they were mercenary engines. And they didn't do, some of the smaller ones or the odder ones didn't do a lot of mainline stuff, but they definitely did a lot of work, and it was like okay, we need a decent amount of motive power here, and we can't spare a really big engine, so we're going to have to send a medium-sized engine from somewhere else to fill in that gap. And that's why when we were going through, when Wywood and I were assessing our motive power, like 1 or 2 years in, maybe more than that. No, it was more than 2 years in. It was a few years in, because we were like, okay, looking at the table of all of the locomotives that were, known, and all the ones that we could get our hands on versus the ones that we already had. It was like, we're going to run out of medium-sized stuff really fast. Okay, we better start building locomotives, we better start building Mikados. And we went back and forth, and I've talked about this, and we went back and forth, and it was like, well, what's the easiest thing? What can we get all of the plans for most easily? Where do we know that they keep all these plans? And it's like, well, what about, like, PRR plans? And those turned out to be the easiest things to get your hands on. And that's why we ended up building a class of L1s, mostly because not only was it very easy to get our hands on those parts, or, well, not those parts, but those plans, the engines themselves were fairly simple. There wasn't really a lot going on with them. They didn't have stokers, they didn't have power reverse, they didn't have a lot of the quality of life stuff that you would expect out of a modern steam locomotive, but we weren't worried about that. What we were worried about was throwing together engines as quickly as possible and being able to interchange parts as much as possible. Now, the other alternative on the table was USRA Mikados, which are very similar in that sense, and they were, more universal. They were used around the country, but we didn't know exactly where to get our hands on USRA plans, at what was effectively short notice. We didn't want to be going down the rabbit hole. We didn't want to be going on a wild goose chase for plans when there were plans available. And we considered doing other classes of engines, but L1s were a good go-to. We considered doing like I1s, because those were just stupidly strong decapods. And I believe we considered doing K4s as well, but we realized we didn't have a need for Pacifics really that much. If we needed speed, we had engines that could manage it. Bigger engines than 587, but engines nonetheless. And so yeah, we decided against that. One of the things we did think about, now I've talked about we built the armored T1, but we did also go, once we got some other plans, we sort of fell face first into some other plans. We did consider making a run of New Haven I1s, because they're just extremely robust. Hudsons that could do a lot and still make very good time. But by that point, gearing up for making another run of steam locomotives wasn't really in the cards, because at that point we were already starting to get, diesel back in the equation. So, anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you next week. Trainman out.